Thanks for having me here. It really is a pleasure. It's an honor. So I wasn't really sure how to structure this talk. I put together like 60 slides and said, well, I could just show a bunch of slides and let people know what we do at the Sports Science Institute. But maybe we'll improvise a little bit too. So I'm not sure which way we'll go. I just want to make sure, can everyone hear me okay in the back, or should I use the microphone? Would the mic be better?
You're great.
We're good. So, you know, in life we ask ourselves a couple of questions. One is, where are you? Or where are you going? And so yesterday, I've been traveling a lot. I just came back from Eastern Europe and then went to New York, and I was at the TSA pre-check and you know, showed my boarding pass and everything. And you know, they ask sometimes obvious questions, and she said, where are you going? And I blanked because I had no idea where I was going. I said, well, you know, I know it's a conference. It's the National Alliance of Social Worker in Sport, but I didn't know what city, and so I didn't know where I was going, kind of. So that wasn't a good answer. And so we always want to be aware of where we're going. But then we also asked, why are we here? And so why am I here with the National Alliance for Social Worker in Sport, and why are you here with me? And when we answer these questions, and you know, we have to be careful whenever we ask a question and answer a question. There can be judgments and bias, and that can lead to, you know, heuristics that may lead to thinking without good understanding. And so I can say, well, I'm here because I took an airplane here and then took a car to get here, or I could say I'm here because I was invited to be here, or but I think when we answer these questions, it's always in a narrative. And that's what you all do as licensed mental health care providers. You try to help people tell a narrative, and you help shape that narrative as professionals, but you hope the narrative is going to make sense. So I have one narrative for why I'm here, and one narrative is that the NCAA, you know, very soon or very shortly after I had come in as chief medical officer about 4.5 years ago, we were heavily criticized for the lack of work we were doing, well, in just about everything that had to do with healthcare, but in particular mental health. And the first several months that I was involved in the NCAA, I really was on a whirlwind tour trying to visit as many schools as possible, really just to build trust and to listen. But my response to this email was, well, so give me some help. So, you know, what do you think is good? I mean, if you think that we're not doing the right job, then put me in touch with someone who can guide me. So they put me in touch with Cindy Miller-Aaron. And I said, okay, great. So I'm going to reach out to her and speak with her. You know, and initially I was a little kind of defensive because, you know, when someone comes after you, so I was going to, like, you know, have her prove herself to me that she was like the, you know, some great mental health savior. But, you know, I just said hello, and you know, just the way that she said hello and kind of disarmed me and said, let's talk. And we've been talking ever since. So Cindy was a member of our first mental health task force. She's a member of the Board of Governors appointed Commission to Combat Sexual Violence, and wrote a very instrumental chapter in Mind, Body, and Sport titled The Haunting Legacy of Abuse. Was instrumental in putting together our best practices, and really has been a mentor to me and a friend, but has introduced me to all of you. So that's really why I'm here. That's one narrative. And the other narrative is that when we look at what we're trying to do, we meaning the NCAA and you, with mental health, and in our best practices, we talk about social workers. We talk about the need for there to be identified licensed mental health care providers on each college campus, which are social workers, which are psychiatrists, which are clinical psychologists, which are nurse practitioners, which are primary healthcare providers who have core competencies in mental health. We're all part of the same team. And so another reason why I'm here is because we need your help. You're really critical to everything we're going to do. But the world needs to know that. And I'm not certain that if we took a survey of 1,100 member schools and said, what is the role of social workers in your school, that the schools would know how to answer that. Would they say, well, is it to discharge athletes, to do discharge planning if they're hospitalized? Or is it to work on social justice issues? Is it to provide some other sort of social care? So another reason I'm here is to help through you to tell the world, the NCAA world, that you are critical for providing licensed mental health care to our student athletes. And to shift the dialogue so that you are part of that dialogue, every day part of that dialogue. That's what's needed. And it's not going to happen in 1 year, and it's not going to happen in 3 years. But I think it could happen in 5 years. That in 5 years, at every single NCAA member school, there is a social worker who is there, integrated as part of an interdisciplinary team to take care of student athletes. And actually, I just thought of that 2 minutes ago.
But why not?
Because I was describing my own work, a different hat I wear with the American Academy of Neurology. We recently started a sports neurology section. We're only 9 years old, and many members of the executive committee, 5 out of 13, voted against us having a section because they said concussion really is dirty work and neurologists shouldn't be involved in that. And I was like, seriously? Who should be involved? But we are sports neurology, we're a young field. And now we have 5 sports neurology fellowships in the country. Our goal is to get 6, so there can be an accreditation for a sports neurologist, just like there's an accreditation for a licensed mental health care provider. So we're all in this together. If we really look at sports medicine, we have a long way to go. A long way to go. And I'll share with you some reasons why I believe that. And maybe we'll get to a couple of slides out of these 60. So one reason is that as a society in the United States of America, we are officially one of the most physically illiterate countries in the developed world. Physical illiteracy is a major cause of morbidity and premature mortality in this country. Physical literacy means you have the ability, competence, and desire to be physically active for life. Physical illiteracy, and I was just at the Department of Defense for an all-day meeting yesterday, physical illiteracy is a national security threat because 50% of the people who would like to serve as military servicemen and women are unable to because they're physically illiterate. Physical illiteracy is one of the major causes of obesity, drug addiction, alcoholism, school dropout, absenteeism from work. And so this is who we are as a country. We're not talking about it. I certainly haven't heard our current president talk about it. Our last president didn't talk about it a lot, but he appointed a Surgeon General who talked about it a lot until that Surgeon General got the pink slip from our current president. So we're not talking about it very much. We aren't organizing our schools so that there can be physical literacy. 75% of high school students don't get the bare number of hours of exercise in. Most schools have cut back on exercise programs. And we take these state-sponsored tests, even though we know if you exercise an hour a day, your academic performance will go up. So that's generally where we are. And so then maybe sport, which you all are interested in, could help that. But what is going on with sport? Are we following the ideals of sport? And I put the ideals of sport, I follow or try to follow in the footsteps of one of my heroes, Nelson Mandela. Nelson Mandela, who was imprisoned for 25 years because of his political and spiritual beliefs, he formed a soccer club. He got permission to form a soccer club in prison, and ultimately they started playing soccer against teams outside of the prison. Next thing you know, he's president of a country where apartheid was finally defeated, and he's hosting the World Cup. But what did Mandela say about sport? He says you can judge a society by the way it treats sport. And how sport should be, it should be equal access for all. When you're engaged in sport, if I'm playing against you, you're playing against me, we go on to the field of play as equals. Doesn't matter what color we are, what religion we are, how we identify ourselves sexually, our socioeconomic background, we are equals. And everyone has access. Everyone. That's what the United States of America was supposed to be with the Amateur Sports Act of 1978, which passed, which empowered the USOC to really develop grassroots program across the country. But then Congress does what it does so well, it defunded the program 100%, so there's no money. We're one of the only countries in the developed world that doesn't have a minister of sport. There's no central control. We're one of the only countries in the developed world that doesn't have strict certification requirements for coaches. In the US, all you have to do is hold up a shingle and say, I'm a coach. And in our society, last time I checked, the day of worship was, for at least one religion, has been replaced by sport. What do you do on Sunday? Sit around and watch the tube all day. More people do that than go to a place of worship. So, judge a society by how it treats sport. How is the United States treating sport? We are super specializing at a young age, meaning that kids are playing one sport, only one sport before the age of puberty, despite all the data that we know that is the wrong thing to do. It leads to early dropout. It leads to peaking at a young age. It leads to injuries. In fact, 75% of kids who specialize drop out of organized sport at the age of puberty. You want to know what early specialization does? Look at ESPN Little League World Series. For the last 30 years, really, really exciting stuff. You see these 12-year-old boys with beards pitching 100-mile-an-hour fastballs. And follow that and see how many of these kids have been starting pitchers on a major league team in the last 30 years, and you will not find one. Not one. Talent identification doesn't begin until about the age of 16. So we're not doing it right. And then concussion. What were we doing at concussion all of these years? What was the neurological community doing? Not much. What was the literature saying? Well, up until 2012, the literature was saying you can return to play the same day after a concussion. Because we didn't know any better. Because the research didn't tell us any better. Because everyone was just treating it as not the issue that we now know it is. And metaphorically, actually, concussion has awakened us. Concussion has told us that we need to treat sport differently. And I think we're starting to get there. The NCAA was founded in 1906 for health and safety reasons. President Roosevelt said, I'm going to ban the sport of football because there were 17 deaths the year before. Even though it's my favorite sport, it's too violent. And then he put together a commission of people, and they formed the NCAA to make football safer. Flash forward, it wasn't until 2013 that the NCAA hired its first chief medical officer. Again, propelled in part by concussion. But now that it's there, now that we're together, we have an amazing ability to shape things. An amazing ability to do so. And I want to talk a little bit about that, about how the NCAA is doing that. I'm probably going to flip through a lot of my slides because I didn't know that slide 1 would take 20 minutes. It was like yesterday, in fact, I think I told someone I flew in from New York yesterday, and I flew in from DC, but it was like yesterday, so we were in the Department of Defense, and I was all prepped. I woke up at 3 in the morning, and I prepared for 5 hours for this meeting, and I had every single detail just nailed down, and we went in with the Defense Health Agency and meeting with the Assistant Secretary of Defense, and actually 2 of them, and President Emmert from the NCAA, and we improvised for an hour and a half. Every once in a while I said, well, don't you want to see at least one of my slides? But we improvised. And what we realized is that, and it was really very cool, that, and I'm going to share a little bit about what the NCAA and DoD are doing together. But if you think of what we need for our military servicemen and women, it's very similar to our student athlete. We want them to be in an optimal state of readiness. An optimal state of readiness. That requires health, it requires safety, it requires peak performance. And so in the middle of this meeting, the Assistant Secretary of Defense said, Brian, what do you think brings about peak performance? And I had not prepared for that in my 5 hours. And I spoke for about 10 minutes, and I talked about how that was evolving. I talked about how all sorts of records were being broken in the 70s, 80s, early 90s, and that many people speculated that women were going to catch up to men in sports because their records were improving at an astronomical pace, and that it was then going to level off. That actually hasn't happened. And the reason women were progressing at an astronomical pace is because their response to anabolic steroids and other anabolic agents was much greater than men. Because a woman muscle does not have any testosterone saturation, whereas a men's is greatly saturated with testosterone. And now you see the curve separating again. But that was one part. Optimal performance. What led to it? Drugs. But what else led to it? Training regimen. Understanding that we need to recover whenever we exert ourselves. Actually, there's something called overtraining, but we all have to overreach. You want to get better for that last part of the sonata you're working on, or you want to get better for hitting just an incredible cross-court forehand, you have to overreach. But every time you overreach, you have to recover. What else has led to that is the whole mental, emotional aspect of sport and training. Understanding that when we're in a situation in the military as an athlete, if you're thinking through what you need to do, you're lost. We should be rehearsing things and be in a place where we are so highly confident and we have addressed our inner fear so that we can confront what we need to at the moment. So I was kind of rambling like that on, and then he said, you know what, we need to do more projects together, because the student-athlete experience and the experience for our military servicemen and women, and really is for a lot. There's a lot of similarities. So that was a total improv for an hour and a half yesterday. But that's kind of life. It's like life that when I was kind of ticked off because someone was coming after the NCAA, that we weren't doing anything, and so then you get a phone call and you're all of a sudden on the phone with someone who changes your life, and that's why I'm here. So my life has changed. My life has changed to be here with you. And I just want to, now I'm going to share with you a little bit some of the things that we do at the NCAA how we work. And by the way, when I say NCAA, I am not the NCAA. I'm a full-time professional paid staff person who's here to serve the NCAA membership. The NCAA membership is 1,100 schools. And if we want a policy to change, if we want a new bylaw, 1,100 schools decide that. Not someone who's a full-time staff person. You represent the NCAA if you're working with a member school much more than I represent the NCAA. But given that, just a couple of things I want to share with you out of these 60 slides. We have a mission and a vision. Importantly, in our mission statement in the first clause, we do not separate excellence from safety and wellness. You can't be excellent if you're not in a safe environment and you're not in a place of wellness. And in the second clause, we want to foster lifelong physical and mental development. We put those together in the same statement because you cannot separate them. Let me give you one concrete example of that. The International Olympic Committee recently put together a task force on pain management in the elite athlete. And we did a world literature search on that. And one part of the world literature search was looking at successful ACL repairs. Has anyone here had a torn ACL? So we had a few anterior cruciate ligament repairs. One of the biggest predictors of a failure of a biomechanically perfect ACL repair is if you develop clinical depression after the surgery. That is a remarkable statement of fact. Because the mind and body are always interacting and determine our physiology. You all know that better than anyone. But we don't always take that into consideration, especially the greatest of all emotions in terms of shifting our physiology, fear. So we know if you're out for a nice little walk in the park and life is beautiful and you're thinking of Blue Sky by the Allman Brothers and you're just kind of having a great time and a snake appears in front of you, within 3/1000ths of a second, your pupils dilate, your heart beats fast, your muscles contract, you become hypervigilant, all within 3/1000ths of a second, and then you consciously become aware of the fact that you are afraid. It's not that you're walking and, you're kind of with Dwayne and thinking about things and, everything's great and you see something that looks like a snake and you say, it's rattling, it looks like a rattlesnake, I think I should be afraid. Because if you do that, you would be dead. So fear shifts our body's physiology before we're consciously aware of it. Then we consciously process and decide what to do with that information. But you know what happens when fear shifts your physiology in a more profound way because you've been assaulted, because you were in an accident and you saw your loved one die, because you were trying to save someone in the ditches and you see his head get blown off. That fear becomes permanently embedded in you. Unless you can somehow come to a peaceful reconciliation with that. So we have these profound emotions, they shift our physiology, and they even shift something as simple as an ACL repair. We must always remember that. In our vision statement, we say we want to be, the preeminent sports science voice, and vision statements are always you want to be the best in the universe. But importantly, we say we want to be the steward of best practices for youth and intercollegiate sport. A very large part of the work that I do, even though we don't have any official jurisdiction over that, is to work with the 47 national governing bodies of sport and to try to come up with a pathway. So, another thing, the NCAA can be criticized for basketball, for example. So that can be not good, but it can be an opportunity. Let's get the whole basketball paradigm right, starting with youth sport. Is that possible? Yeah, it might be possible. So, It's a way of understanding the continuum and working together. And my battery is very low. So I actually have a charger.
I'll get it set up for you. I crawl under the table to do it.
I have to acknowledge that, I think. So I'll just go on. The next slide, I was going to talk about how we have put things together. We've developed what we call strategic priorities. And I have gone on public record saying that concussion is the elephant in the room. So if we do everything perfectly, but if the NCAA does not solve concussion, I think we'll be considered a failure. So concussion is the elephant in the room, but mental health is the single most important issue affecting our student athletes today, and we must address that. So that's two strategic priorities, concussion and mental health, but we have others. Cardiovascular care. Why that? Well, because every year 10 student athletes die of sudden cardiac death, and no one's talking about it. Another one, sexual violence. We all know about sexual violence. Another, doping and drug abuse. Another, overuse injuries and periodization. And then another one is sleep and nutrition. And then finally, how do we deliver athletics health care?
When that turns back on, your computer, I think, actually shut down.
Aha.
So when you turn it back on, it should reconnect.
And making data-driven decisions. So just in brief, these 9 strategic priorities, they all have knowledge gaps in them. In other words, mental health, what's the knowledge gap? Do we know really all of the details of mental health? Or cardiac care, why are our kids dying of sudden cardiac death? And now I'm going to just log on a little bit. So what we've done is we developed a model, and Cindy was part of one of those models. We put together task forces. And at task forces, we would try to put together original research. We identified what we did know, what we didn't know, and then we would come up with documents, and these are some of the documents we've come up with: mental health best practices, or concussion diagnosis and management, or independent medical care, or sexual violence prevention. And every time we do this, it's because we understand that there's new scientific evidence that might affect the association, or there's a core value being impacted, sexual violence. There's a legal risk to the association, concussion, or a reputational risk to the association, really anything. And this is sort of the model that we've developed, and I wanted to show you just a couple of models to actually walk you through how we're doing this. So concussion. I know you all aren't here to hear a concussion lecture, but it is important because one of the things that predicts prolonged post-concussion syndrome is developing depression or anxiety after a concussion. And if that is not managed properly, you will not improve. Another thing that predicts prolonged post-concussion syndrome is developing a sleep disorder after concussion. So the work you do is really critical to concussion. So we had meetings about concussion, and what's the knowledge gap? Well, we don't know the natural history of concussion. How many here have been concussed? So if you saw me as a neurologist, I couldn't tell you what your anticipated natural history is 30 years from now, because no one knows. Now, the New York Times thinks it knows, but no one knows. We don't understand neurobiological recovery in concussion. When we send our athletes back to play, we know that they're clinically recovered, but no one has ever done the research to see if the brain has recovered. There's a difference. And so we ended up coming together with the Department of Defense, and you might ask, why the Department of Defense and not something like the National Football League? Well, because we're much more similar to the DoD than to our professional athletes in football. Only 1% of college football players become NFL players. 1% of NCAA student athletes become professional athletes. 99% become professionals in something else. So, but if we look at the DoD, out of the 350,000